When we think of Theseus, we imagine a fearless hero, the slayer of the Minotaur and founder of Athens. But what if behind this shining facade lay a dark, almost psychopathic nature? Today, we will delve into the forgotten pages of history to uncover the bloody exploits that the Athenians would prefer to erase from memory. Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and let's get started. Imagine the scene. A weary traveler, exhausted from a long journey under the scorching Attic sun, sees a neat house by the road. The hospitable host, with a broad smile, invites him in, offering food, wine, and, most importantly, a place to stay for the night. Exhaustion takes its toll, and the guest gratefully accepts. The host, Procrustes himself, leads him to a bed covered with soft skins. But hospitality was only a mask hiding a sadistic nature. Procrustes had two beds, one short and one long. If the guest was tall, he was laid on the short bed, and anything that protruded beyond its limits was cut off. If the guest was short, he was laid on the long bed, and, with the help of special mechanisms, his body was stretched until his bones came out of their joints, and his tendons tore with a dull crack. It was this monster that the young Theseus encountered on his way to Athens. He was no ordinary traveler. Every step on this road was not just a journey for him, but a statement. He deliberately sought encounters with robbers in order to rid the land of evil and prove his right to be called a hero. When Procrustes lured him into his house, Theseus probably already knew what awaited him. What happened next is described by the ancient Greek mythographer Apollodorus in his work Library. Theseus did not simply defeat the robber in fair combat. He decided to teach him a lesson filled with icy, mirror-like cruelty. He forcibly laid Procrustes himself on his own bed. The sources do not specify which bed, but the outcome was the same. Theseus used his tormentor's own method against him. If the bed was too short, he cut off Procrustes' head and legs. If it was long, he stretched him to death. Justice? Perhaps. But it was justice without a drop of mercy. Justice that in itself becomes an act of monstrous reprisal. In this act, Theseus appears not as a noble knight, but as a cold-blooded executioner who takes pleasure in the symmetry of retribution. This is where the famous expression Procrustean bed comes from, an attempt to force something into a rigid, artificial framework, sacrificing something important in the process. Having cleared the way to Athens, Theseus arrived in the city as a triumphant hero. But his main test was yet to come. Athens was under the yoke of the Cretan king Minos, who demanded a terrible tribute. Every 9 years, the city had to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete to be eaten by the Minotaur, a monster with the body of a man and the head of a bull, locked in the labyrinth. Theseus volunteered to go with the next group of doomed victims, vowing to kill the monster. In Crete, he was seen by the daughter of King Minos, Ariadne. She fell in love with the Athenian hero and decided to help him, betraying her father and her homeland. She secretly gave Theseus a ball of thread so that he could find his way out of the labyrinth's tangled corridors, and a sharp sword. Without her help, Theseus's mission would have been doomed to failure. He would have been either killed by the Minotaur or lost forever in the endless maze. Theseus killed the monster and, following the thread, led himself and the rescued Athenian youths and maidens out of the labyrinth. Ariadne was waiting for him. Together, they fled Crete under the cover of night. It seemed like the beginning of a beautiful love story. The hero and the princess who saved him were sailing towards a new life. Their ship stopped at the island of Naxos. The morning on Naxos was quiet. A light breeze barely stirred the cypress trees, and the waves lazily lapped at the sandy shore. Ariadne woke up alone. The cold spot next to her on the makeshift bed of cloaks indicated that Theseus had gotten up long ago. She sat up, brushing her tangled hair aside, and looked out at the sea. And there, on the horizon, she saw a familiar sail, a tiny dot receding further and further away. First came bewilderment, then a chilling realization. He had abandoned her, asleep, alone, on a desert island. A cry of despair stuck in her throat, turning into a silent scream. This act, mentioned by Hesiod in his Theogony, is one of the darkest spots on Theseus's reputation. Why did he do it? The versions of the myths differ. Some say that the god Dionysus appeared to him in a dream and ordered him to leave Ariadne, as she was destined to be his wife, the god of wine and merriment. Others, later and more rational authors, suggested that Theseus simply did not want to bring a barbarian princess, the daughter of an enemy, to Athens, as this could cause political complications. This is reminiscent of a situation in modern corporate life, when an ambitious manager uses the ideas and help of a talented but naive colleague for a major project, and after receiving a promotion and recognition, does everything to forget about his contribution, or even get rid of him as an unnecessary witness to his path to success. Regardless of his motives, the fact remains. Theseus used Ariadne. She was merely a tool for him, a means to an end. Once the goal was achieved and the tool had served its purpose, it was ruthlessly discarded. There is not a shred of heroism in this act, only cold, pragmatic calculation and black ingratitude. These two episodes, the execution of Procrustes and the betrayal of Ariadne, show us a completely different Theseus. Not the shining hero of the Amphorae, but a man whose determination borders on cruelty and whose pragmatism borders on meanness. These are not accidental mistakes, but fundamental character traits that will manifest themselves more than once. His path to glory was paved not only with the bodies of monsters, but also with the broken destinies of those who had the misfortune to trust him. But the shadow of betrayal cast on the shore of Naxos followed Theseus's ship, weaving itself into its sails, which remained mournfully black. There was no evil intent on the part of the gods, or any curse. It was the quintessence of Theseus's own nature. Returning victorious, covered in glory, intoxicated with success, he was consumed by himself. Thoughts of his old father, who climbed the rock at Cape Sunion every day and gazed into the distance, simply did not fit into his mind, overflowing with his own greatness. The promise he had made to Aegeus, to change the black sails to white in case of victory, became an insignificant detail, small print in the grand contract of his triumph. This was not simple forgetfulness, like a man who left his keys at home in a hurry. It was the forgetfulness of a narcissist for whom the world shrinks to a mirror reflecting his own face. While Theseus and his crew celebrated on deck, anticipating a rapturous welcome in Athens, the final scene of his father's tragedy was playing out on the rock. For Aegeus, the black sail on the horizon was not just a piece of cloth, it was a sentence. The whole world, all hope, all meaning in his aging life collapsed in an instant. Plutarch and Apollodorus describe his despair sparingly, but behind this brevity lies an abyss of grief. He did not wait for confirmation, did not listen to consolation. He simply stepped off the cliff into the raging waves that have since borne his name, the Aegean Sea. Theseus thus ascended the Athenian throne on the bones not only of his enemies, but also of his own father. His reign began with a tragedy caused by his egocentric disregard. The city gained a great hero and king, but at what cost? Athenian propaganda later turned this episode into a sad accident, a tragic misunderstanding. But if you look deeper, it was a natural outcome. A man capable of abandoning the woman who saved his life on an island was just as capable of forgetting his father's feelings, blinded by the glamour of his own glory. After becoming king, Theseus did not settle down. His adventurous and conquering spirit demanded new exploits. Peaceful life, building temples, and reforming laws were too boring for him. His gaze turned north, to the shores of the Black Sea, where, according to rumors, a tribe of female warriors, the Amazons, lived. Accompanied by his friend, the Lapith king Pirithous, a figure no less reckless and immoral, Theseus set off on a campaign. This was not a war for resources or territory. It was, in essence, a bandit raid, dictated by a desire to satisfy his ego and obtain an exotic trophy. This trophy was the queen of the Amazons, whose name, according to various versions, was Antiope or Hippolyta. Theseus kidnapped her. He did not try to form an alliance or negotiate. He simply took what he wanted, like a predator dragging away its prey. He brought her to Athens and made her his wife or concubine. He probably expected everyone to admire his daring. But he underestimated the Amazons. They were not docile victims. They were a proud and powerful nation of warriors, for whom the honor of their sister and queen was above all else. The consequences were not long in coming. Gathering a huge army, the Amazons crossed the Bosporus, marched through Greece, and laid siege to Athens. Imagine the horror of the townspeople. The war, provoked by the personal whim of their king, had come to their doorstep. Blood was spilled in the streets of the city itself, at the walls of the Acropolis. Plutarch describes this war, known as the Attic War, in detail. It was a brutal and bloody battle. The Athenians had to fight for their homes and their children, all because their king wanted an exotic woman. Many people on both sides died in this war. Antiope herself was killed, fighting either on the side of her kidnapper husband or on the side of her sisters. The myths differ here, leaving room for interpretation of her tragic fate. Theseus, of course, emerged victorious here as well. The Athenians repelled the attack. But the city was ravaged, and thousands of bodies lay in the fields around it. The official version was, "Our great king has protected us from the savage barbarians." But in the silence of the houses, where the dead husbands and sons were mourned, another question was surely being asked. Was the king's whim worth all this bloodshed? Theseus once again demonstrated complete disregard for the consequences of his actions on his own people. He was not a protector, but a source of danger, a man whose personal impulses put the entire state at risk. Years passed, but Theseus's character did not change. On the contrary, with age, his recklessness and sense of permissiveness only grew stronger. His friendship with Pirithous became a catalyst for the most insane ideas. Upon reaching the age of 50, the two elderly adventurers decided that their status entitled them to wives of noble birth, the daughters of Zeus himself. Their choice fell on Helen, daughter of Leda and the Thunderer, and Persephone, daughter of Demeter and wife of Hades, lord of the underworld. Helen was their first target. At that time, she was still a child, between 7 and 12 years old, according to various sources. Theseus and Pirithous broke into Sparta, where the girl was performing a ritual dance in the temple of Artemis, and simply kidnapped her. This was not a romantic abduction of a bride, but a vile act of pedophilia and kidnapping committed by 2 adult men. They cast lots, and Helen went to Theseus. He took her to the Athenian fortress of Aphidna and left her in the care of his mother, Aphra, intending to wait until the girl was old enough to marry. This act provoked the wrath of Sparta. Helen's brothers, the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, gathered an army, invaded Attica, destroyed Aphidna, freed their sister, and, in revenge, took Theseus's mother into slavery. Once again, the king's personal, immoral act led to war, humiliation, and suffering for his loved ones and his country. But their madness did not end there. Having satisfied Theseus's whim, Pirithous demanded help with his part of the bargain, the abduction of Persephone from the kingdom of the dead itself. Any sane person would consider this suicide and blasphemy, but not Theseus. True to his reckless friendship, he agreed. They descended into Hades. It was not a heroic mission like that of Orpheus, who sought to regain his love, or Heracles, who carried out the will of the gods. It was a brazen visit by robbers, intent on kidnapping the queen from one of the most powerful gods. Hades, however, proved to be more cunning. He pretended to be pleased to see his guests and invited them to sit on a stone throne to share a meal with him. As soon as Theseus and Pirithous sat down, they became stuck to the rock. The stone seemed to become an extension of their flesh, binding them with invisible chains. Thus ended their journey. Pirithous, as the main instigator, remained there forever. After a long time, Heracles, performing his last feat, managed with great difficulty to tear Theseus away from the rock. But part of Theseus's flesh remained on the stone. He returned to the world of the living, but he was no longer the same. He was broken, humiliated, and forever marked by his stay in the realm of the dead. The return from Hades was the beginning of the end for Theseus. While he was away, a tragedy unfolded in his home that completely destroyed his reputation and family. His new wife was Phaedra, another daughter of Minos and sister of Ariadne, whom he had abandoned. Fate mocked him by binding him to the same family he had once betrayed. Theseus had a son, Hippolytus, by the Amazon Antiopa, whom he had kidnapped. He was a young man of strict morals, who despised carnal love and worshipped only Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt. Phaedra fell madly in love with her stepson. Rejected by him, she fell into despair and, wanting revenge, killed herself. But before her death, she left a note accusing Hippolytus of trying to rape her. And so, Theseus, having just been snatched from the clutches of death, returns home to find his wife's corpse and the slanderous letter. What does a wise ruler and loving father do in this situation? He should have conducted an investigation, listened to his son, and questioned the evidence. But Theseus was neither wise nor loving. His reaction was instantaneous, furious, and completely irrational. His wounded pride, anger, and possessiveness took over. He refused to listen to Hippolytus's excuses. He immediately turned to his divine father Poseidon, who had once granted him 3 wishes, and demanded the death of his own son. This was his most terrible deed. Not the murder of an enemy, not the betrayal of a beloved, but a cold-blooded curse condemning his own flesh and blood to death. Poseidon heard the prayer. As Hippolytus rode his chariot along the seashore, a monstrous beast emerged from the waves. The frightened horses bolted, the chariot overturned, and the young man, entangled in the reins, was torn apart, his body dragged along the sharp coastal rocks. The dying Hippolytus was brought to his father. At that moment, the goddess Artemis appeared and revealed the truth to Theseus. His son was innocent, and Phaedra had lied. The realization came too late. Theseus was left alone, amid the ruins of his family, destroyed by his own anger and gullibility. The great hero, the slayer of monsters, proved incapable of dealing with the main monster, the one that lived in his own soul. This story, immortalized in Euripides' tragedy Hippolytus, is not just a family drama. It is a condemnation of Theseus as a man. He proved himself incapable of judgment, prone to rage, ready to destroy what was most dear to him because of his wounded pride. After all these events, wars, kidnappings, family tragedies, the Athenians began to see their king in a different light. His heroic past faded. They saw before them an aging, cruel, and unpredictable tyrant whose actions brought only misfortune to the city. Even his great achievement, the Synoicism, the violent unification of the scattered communities of Attica under the rule of Athens, now looked different. It was not a blessing for all, but an act of asserting personal power, suppressing independence for the sake of centralization. The people were tired of him. A new leader appeared in Athens, Menosphios. He skillfully exploited the discontent of the people, reminding the aristocrats of their lost privileges and the common people of the wars and misfortunes that Theseus had brought upon them. As a result, the Athenian assembly voted to expel their king. The founding hero was banished from the city he himself had created. Theseus went to the island of Skyros, where he had some ancestral lands, and asked the local king, Lycomedes, for asylum. Lycomedes accepted him, but secretly feared the exile's fame and influence. Under the pretext of showing Theseus his possessions from a high cliff, he treacherously pushed him into the sea. Thus ended the life of the great hero, not in glorious battle, not on a royal bed surrounded by loving subjects, but as a result of a vile murder, thrown off a cliff like useless rubbish. Ironically, he died almost the same way as his father Aegeus, only this time his fall was not voluntary, but violent. Athens chose to forget its founder for many years. Only centuries later, during the Greco-Persian Wars, did the Delphic oracle command the Athenians to find and return Theseus's remains to his homeland. The commander Cimon carried out this command, and the hero's bones were reburied with honors in Athens. A new, cleaned-up and polished cult of Theseus was created, the ideal ruler, wise legislator, and defender of democracy. All the dark pages were carefully erased from his biography. Ariadne's betrayal, the abduction of Helen, the curse of Hippolytus, his exile. History was rewritten by the victors. But myths, if read carefully, preserved the truth about a man whose heroic face hid the soul of a psychopath and whose great deeds were inseparable from bloody crimes. Let's take a closer look at the scene with Procrustes. It was not the justice of the victor, it was the art of a maniac. Theseus did not simply eliminate the threat, he appropriated its method, absorbed its poison, and made it his signature style, which would manifest itself again and again. Punishment must be not only inevitable, but also humiliatingly symbolic. He did not simply kill the robber, he turned his body into a living embodiment of his own crime. This act revealed not strength, but a dangerous tendency towards theatrical cruelty, towards domination not only over the enemy's body, but also over his very essence, his idea. It was his manifesto. I am not just stronger than you, I will become your worst nightmare, your ugly reflection. He did not eradicate evil, he absorbed it, becoming a more effective and purposeful version of it. And this same cold logic of an instrumental approach to living beings manifested itself in the story of Ariadne. The betrayal on Naxos was not just an impulsive decision. If we discard the mythological husk of Dionysus's intervention, what remains is pure calculation. Ariadne, the daughter of his enemy, was useful on Crete. In Athens, however, she became a problem. She was a living reminder that his greatest feat had not been accomplished alone. She was a witness to his vulnerability, the bearer of his debt. For a man with a pathological desire to be the sole author of his triumph, such a witness was an unbearable hindrance. By leaving her on the island, he not only got rid of political inconveniences, he edited his biography, erasing his co-author from it. Moreover, from the point of view of pragmatic politics, his action was the height of stupidity. Marriage to the Cretan princess could have turned yesterday's enemy into an ally, ensured Athens' security from the sea, and opened up new trade routes. But Theseus sacrificed strategic advantage for the sake of personal psychological comfort. It was more important for him to preserve the myth of himself as a loner than to ensure the well-being of his state. This decision reveals him not as a statesman, but as an egocentric for whom personal narrative is more important than reality. The same narcissism colors the tragedy with Aegeus. His father's death was no accident. It was the logical outcome of his character. Psychologists would call it symbolic patricide. To become a full-fledged king, Theseus had to do more than just return. He had to take his father's place. His forgetfulness with the sails was an unconscious act aimed at eliminating the old order. He returned not as a son to his father, but as a new king, ushering in a new era. In this new era, there was simply no place for the old, anxious, and expectant Aegeus. Theseus was so absorbed in his new role that he literally erased from memory the figure who had occupied that role before him. And when he stood on the Athenian shore and the people praised him as their savior and new ruler, his grief was hardly profound. Rather, it was an annoying complication of his triumph, which, however, only accelerated his ascension to the throne. He gained power, washed not only with the blood of the Minotaur, but also with the tears and then the blood of his own father. His friendship with Pyrrhophoi deserves special consideration. It was not a union of equals, but rather a toxic symbiosis of two predators who brought out the basest instincts in each other. If Theseus was a calculating strategist of cruelty, then Pyrrhophoi was pure, unbridled impulse. Together, they formed the perfect mechanism for committing crimes. They were mirrors for each other, in which each saw not his own vices, but only confirmation of his own exceptionality and right to break any laws, human and divine. The abduction of 12-year-old Helen was not a spontaneous impulse. It was a carefully planned act, a demonstration of complete contempt for the laws of hospitality, for the honor of another kingdom, for the very concept of innocence. It was a statement: we can take whatever we want, and we will not be punished for it. Their descent into Hades is the culmination of this madness. This is no longer just a crime, it is a metaphysical rebellion. They decided that their will was above the fundamental laws of the universe. Pirithous' desire to possess Persephone was not mere lust. It was an attempt by a mortal to encroach on the very structure of existence, to steal a goddess from the god responsible for the cycle of life and death. And Theseus, instead of stopping his mad friend, enthusiastically supported him. Why? Because for him, it was the ultimate challenge. Defeating the Minotaur is a feat for a hero. Challenging death itself is a feat for a god. At that moment, Theseus finally ceased to consider himself human. The punishment they suffered was ingenious in its simplicity. Hades did not torture them. He simply invited them to sit down. And the stone throne, the chair of oblivion, became the material embodiment of their pride. They were so eager to take the place of the gods that they literally grew into the throne of the underworld, becoming its immovable, helpless part. Heracles, tearing Theseus from the rock, saved his body, but not his soul. Part of him remained there forever, in the cold darkness, and he returned to the world of the living, incomplete, broken, but still unaware of the depth of his fall. It was in this state of brokenness and blind self-confidence that he encountered the tragedy of Phaedra. His reaction to his wife's suicide note was not that of a father, but of a tyrant whose property had been dared to be defiled. In his eyes, Hippolytus was not a son, but a rebellious vassal. The curse sent through Poseidon is not just a flash of anger, it is an act of delegating violence. Theseus, accustomed to doing everything with his own hands, here, for the first time, uses divine administration to eliminate the problem. He does not want to stain his hands with his son's blood, but he craves his death. This shows not only his cruelty, but also his cowardice. He shifts the responsibility onto the god, so that later, when the truth comes out, he can throw up his hands and refer to divine will. But even the goddess Artemis, appearing to justify her favorite Hippolytus, does not express sympathy for Theseus. She coldly states the fact, "You killed your son because of a deceitful woman and your own anger." At this moment, the last bastion of his heroic image collapses. He appears as a pitiful, deceived old man whose life is a series of catastrophic mistakes paid for with the lives of others. His expulsion from Athens was not just a political coup, it was the verdict of the people. Menospius, his opponent, was not so much a brilliant politician as a skilled prosecutor. He did not need to invent anything. He simply gathered together all of Theseus's exploits and presented them to the Athenians in their true light. He brought war with the Amazons to our walls because of his lust. He brought the wrath of Sparta upon us by kidnapping a child. He abandoned his people to go to Hades on a whim of his friend. He killed his own heir without trial or investigation. He rules not by law, but by caprice. Do we need such a king? And the Athenians, tired of constant wars, fear and instability generated by their ruler, said no. They had outgrown their hero. They understood that building a state requires stable laws, not an unpredictable adventurer. Theseus's death on Skyros is a logical and deeply symbolic ending. King Lycomedes, who pushed him off a cliff, treated him the same way Theseus himself treated his enemies and obstacles in his path. He eliminated him treacherously, without a fair fight, when he became inconvenient. His whole life was an ascent to the top, achieved by pushing and shoving others aside. And in the end, someone came along who pushed him off in exactly the same way. He died not as a hero, but as a political problem that was disposed of in the simplest and most cynical way possible. His body, swallowed by the same sea as his father's, became the final rhyme in this bloody poem. Athens, having created a posthumous cult of the ideal ruler, committed the last and most important act of betrayal. They betrayed the truth about him, replacing a complex, cruel, and tragic monster with a convenient and safe icon. But the real Theseus remained there, in the dark depths of myth, as an eternal warning that the face of a hero can hide the deepest abyss. Theseus undoubtedly left his mark on history, but his legacy is stained with the blood of innocence and the betrayal of loved ones. From the abandonment of Ariadne to the death of his own son, his actions are more reminiscent of a psychopath than an ideal hero. Perhaps this is why Athens tried to forget these episodes, preferring to remember only the bright side. But the truth, as always, is multifaceted. That's all for now. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and see you again in